Sal is getting mic'd up. I will give him a short and very sweet introduction, which is simply this, that Sal Khan is the coolest person in America today. He will be the person who has the most impact on America in the future. He is my notion of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin started about 300 years ago a one-room schoolhouse. It was a notion that mixed the classical academy of learning for learning's sake with practical learning, which Benjamin Franklin thought that Thomas Jefferson didn't get, but Franklin got. They used a pretty simple model, which is a person standing in front of a blackboard and just talking. The problem is we pretty much use that model today, 24 kids in a classroom like that, and we've regressed a little bit because Ben Franklin loved the fact that you could have a one-room school in which people of different ages would be helping each other. Now we track people silly so that nobody can help each other and you just have to wait for that teacher to come in and lecture at you. I've vamped enough, so everybody should be taking their seats. And we will begin. The only other thing I'll say about him being the coolest person in America, and this may be redundant, but you're from New Orleans.
I'm from New Orleans, yes.
You would, of course, have to be from New Orleans to be the coolest person in America. And Khan Academy starts, in some ways, with my old high school, Newman, when your niece, what's her name?
Nadia.
Nadia.
Cousin Nadia.
Cousin Nadia. After the storm, needs some help. So why don't you explain the beginning of it all?
Yeah, and actually this was before the storm. This was in 2004. Nadia, who at the time had just finished 6th grade at Newman, which is where you attended, was a, it turned out, she had visited me in Boston after our wedding, and it turned out that she was having trouble in math, and I told her, well, I have trouble believing that, or I think you're capable of getting beyond that, so how about when you go back to New Orleans? And I was in Boston at the time, we tutor each other, or I help her out over the phone, and so she agreed. And you fast forward about 18 months, word got around in the family that free tutoring was happening, and I was tutoring about, depending on the week, 10 to 15 cousins and family friends every day after work. I was an analyst at an investment firm at the time, and and by this point we had moved out to Silicon Valley. It was 2006, and I started writing all the software for mostly my cousins to get practice, and for me as their tutor to see what they were doing. And I was showing this to a friend over dinner, and he said, well, this is great, but you're probably having trouble scaling up the lessons you're giving. I'm like, yeah, it's really hard now with all these students. And he said, well, why don't you put some up on YouTube? I thought it was a silly idea. I thought YouTube's for cats playing piano, not serious math. But I got over the idea that it wasn't my idea, and I gave it a shot. And my cousins famously told me that they like me better on YouTube than in person. And then I just kept going. And you fast forward 2009. Quit my job to set it up as a not-for-profit. 2010, we got our first major funding, and now we're kind of out there to, I still make videos, but we're translating into a bunch of languages. And it's not just about videos. In fact, most of it is about how do we create a platform that can really be kind of a holistic learning environment. If someone has nothing else, it's this free virtual school for the world. And if there is a physical classroom, how can this be a tool to supercharge it?
You have a video, is that right, that we could do?
I think we have a montage video.
Yeah. Should we do that, Deb?
That one right there. Volume.
And volume.
Actions are just due to the gravity over interstellar, or almost
well,
you could call it intergalactic. This animal's fossils are only found in this. We could integrate over the surface, and the notation usually is a capital sigma. All of these interactions are just due to the gravity over interstellar, or almost you could call it intergalactic. This animal's fossils are only found in this area of South America. A nice clean band here. Notice this is an aldehyde, and it's an alcohol. Is there 30 million? Plus the $20 million from the American manufacturer. They create the Committee of Public Safety, which sounds like a very nice committee.
This is not Eve.
No, Botticelli's portrayed the ancient goddess of love.
This is 6 times 6 times 6, or 216.
I'm told the humidity makes it feel hotter. Why is this?
Excellent question, LeBron.
Let's just make it 11.
Play with the pendulum and get a feel for how it moves.
Function as a bridge rectifier.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
If this does not blow your mind, then you have no emotion. we could integrate over the surface, and the notation usually is a capital sigma. All of these
Up. So you basically see how it works.
On the video side, yes, that's a good little montage.
And if you go to whatever it is, just Google Khan Academy, I go there and there may be how many thousand now?
Yeah, there's now I think 3,400 is the last count of how many videos we have.
And so for me, I used to take some math courses there, but branch out a little and did a little of that art history. But you can just start clicking where you want, right?
Yeah, that's the general idea. Is that it started with me doing mainly pre-algebra, algebra for my cousins, and then after I'd done 70 or 80 videos, I thought, well, that's a pretty good scaffold of algebra. Let me do geometry. And 100 videos later, well, let me try calculus. And after a little while, it became kind of like this Forrest Gumpian adventure of how much can I do? So yeah, I just kept going. And now you saw in the videos, it wasn't all me. It's still disproportionately me, but we have some folks who do art history. We have some people who do these other kind of project-y type things. But our goal is to really cover all major topics. We have translations into 12 different languages. But more than that, we have a whole interactive layer that gives reporting and feedback for students, parents, teachers, everything else.
Well, let's start with the video component. One of the parts of the secret sauce is just no frills video, right? And they're 9 to 12 minutes?
Yeah, in those early days, literally that first weekend that my buddy suggested doing this, I said, well, let me try doing it. I looked around my room and there was no video camera. I didn't feel like buying one. So I said, well, there must be some type of software that lets you capture what you're doing on your screen. And then I do a search for it. It's like, oh, it's called screen capture software. Great. And there was this, I remember at the time, it was this $20, it was literally $20, and I didn't want to pay it, so I got like the 30-day free trial. And then I was like, okay, if I have that, now what can I do? And actually, when I was doing these tutorials with Nadia, we were using Yahoo Doodle, which was included on their instant messenger. It was this you could write, and the other person would see it. And I was like, okay, well, what could I do? Oh, my operating system comes with Microsoft Paint. I'll just make the background black. I'll pick some nice colors that look like pastel chalk, and I'll just do screen capture with it. And I'll use the same headset that I literally used when I worked online with my cousins. And that first video, it actually wasn't, it kind of worked. In fact, what was really valuable is that the sound was good. A lot of the online lectures you see, there's a video camera in a lecture hall, and you can't see the sound and you can't see the writing, which are the two most important parts of it. You can see the room and the people, but then I uploaded that first video, and it got turned down by YouTube because it was too long. It was like 13 minutes. YouTube limits you to 10. I said, well, I guess I have to do it shorter. And so that was actually a really good disciplining factor. But then I just, and the first few videos are up there. You can do a search by date. But yeah, and then I just, but I actually started to find that was actually the perfect chunk from the producer's point of view as well. It was the right amount of time to get an idea out there. I could do it in real time. I didn't have to edit it.
And just so let's leap forward real quick so people can put it in perspective. You're doing it that way with your 30-day free trial. How many video views are you getting now, and how many people use your service?
Yeah, now we've had 200 million video views to date. It's 6.5 million unique people are using the site every month. We could talk more about the exercise and stuff, but they've done 750 million exercises on the site, every country in the world. So yeah, it's grown a little bit since my cousins.
For those of you who were in Aspen, how many years ago when Bill Gates was on stage, right?
That was a little over 2 years ago.
And that's when your inflection point was just about happening.
I need to thank you for that. Yeah. Well, it literally happened. So 2009, I quit my job. Yeah. And it was, I never had started a not-for-profit before, but it felt like, at least on the usage, that it was hitting this kind of hockey stick. And so, but I think like a lot of these things, it was 9 months later, there was no significant funding. We were burning into savings, and someone named Ann Doerr.
Yeah, let us give a shout out. Everybody here probably knows Ann, who husband is on the board. But one day, out of the blue, Ann Doerr just...
I get a $10,000 check.
Yeah.
And so I immediately emailed, she had her email there, I immediately emailed her back, and I said, well, thank you very much. This is the largest donation the Khan Academy has ever gotten. If we were a physical school, you would now have a building named after you, which is very inexpensive, I now learn. I think at Stanford it will buy you a bench at best.
Wouldn't even buy you a bench
No,
at Aspen.
not
Go
even a
ahead.
bench at Aspen. I need to learn a little bit.
I know how much a bench is.
But,
I'll go for it.
And then we had lunch in downtown Palo Alto at an Indian buffet, and Ann says, well, you know, what's your goal here? And I said, oh, free virtual school for the world. The mission statement is a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And she said, well, you know, that's ambitious. How are you supporting yourself? And as proud of a way as possible, I said, I'm not. And so she kind of nodded, and we left. She got on her bike. I got back in my car. And when I came home, she sent a text message saying, you know, you really need to be supporting yourself. I just wired you $100,000. So it was a good day. And but
that's when I think she turned a lot of us on. I mean, she turned.
Yeah, no, that was huge. It was huge validation, and then it got even crazier. And this is where you come into the story. Is 2 months later, I was running a little summer camp with a friend. To really kind of, you know, I was this virtual teacher, but I always had this aspirations of what can you do with the kids in a physical environment. And I had 6 kids playing a game of Risk, and I had another 20 kids trading securities based on the outcome of the game of Risk. Yeah. And while that was happening, I got another text message from Ann, and she said, I'm at the Aspen Ideas Festival in the main pavilion. Walter Isaacson and Bill Gates is on stage, and Bill Gates has been talking about how he uses Khan Academy for the last, 3-4 minutes. Yeah. At which point I booted the nearest 7th grader off of a computer, and I immediately started, are people tweeting about this, what's going on, et cetera, it had happened. I mean, you were there, but it wasn't being streamed or anything. And but yeah, it was surreal.
And now they're big funders, right?
Oh yeah. Now what happened. I say it was very surreal because I didn't know what to do next. Do I call him? I don't know. I mean, you might have his number. But yeah, 2 weeks later, Larry Cohen, his chief of staff, reached out, gave a call. He was able to find my number, and said, you might have heard Bill's a fan, and I was like, oh, yeah, I heard that, and he'd like to fly you up if you have some time. And I said, I was looking at my calendar at the moment. It was
blank.
Completely blank.
Yeah.
Completely blank. And I said, yeah, I got to cut my nails on Wednesday, but other than that, I can fly in and do something. Yeah.
And but they have now funded pretty much. They're your main funder.
They in 2 years ago, almost exactly, it was them and Google that were kind of the first 2 large funders that allowed us to get to scale. Since then, the Doors have been significant funders. Several other people in Silicon Valley, Reed Hastings of Netflix, Scott and Signe Cook. I could go on and on.
Tell us a little bit about the in your book. By the way, is the book for sale out there? You got to get the book. It really just came out because you can see I still have the galley.
Yeah.
But it's the One World Schoolhouse, and you talk about the crisis in education. What is the crisis in education, really?
Yeah, and I think this is where everyone kind of feels this.
And by the way, you have to buy the book. Don't. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so what I'm about to do
it
is
a great book. I stayed up all night when I got the galleys and read it. And I don't always do that. This is a great book. Go ahead.
Oh no, when he told me that, I was a little bit in awe. But anyway, that's I think I start off really talking about in this context. Everyone kind of talks about a crisis in education, but normally what people cite is this crisis of comparing us to our test scores to Singapore or Finland, or we're right behind Estonia when our kids come to factoring polynomials. Yeah. And what I point out is that that's actually not the issue. We should look at it and not be complacent about it, but America's not about to lose its primacy because of that. If anything, if you look at the last 50 years, innovation, creativity has only become more centered in America. What seldom gets reported on is that you actually have delegations, and they actually come and visit our office. They come visit from Singapore and Finland and South Korea, coming to the US, observing American schools to say, we need to make our kids better critical thinkers. We're pumping out engineers, but we still don't have a Facebook. We're pumping out engineers, but we still don't have a Google. What are we doing wrong? We thought our test scores are off the charts. And so they're trying to say, how do we get this Americanism in our schools, this creativity? And so what I point out in the book is the crisis, there's a couple of things. Is one, how do we make sure that as America continues to be the engine of innovation, that we have everyone is able to participate, not just the people who happen to get the skills that are, the small fraction right now that are able to, do the Googles of the world, but also instead of saying, how do we make our Prussian model of education, this model of, literally, lectures, this is assembly line model, instead of saying, how do we make our Prussian model more like the Prussian model in Singapore or the Prussian model in Finland, it's really how do we make our education system more American? How do we give more space for creativity? How do we give more space for, so where failure isn't stigmatized? I mean, that's a core essence of entrepreneurialism. Any other country, Singapore, South Korea, you fail, you're a failure. Right. And that's actually also the way our school system works, is a grade is viewed as a judgment on your abilities. It's not viewed as, hey, you need something to work on. In America, there is a stigma to failure, but it's a lot less. If you fail, you say, well, okay, I didn't work that time. Let me keep working on it. And I think, it's not just pie in the sky thoughts anymore. There actually are tools where you can get the rigor, or more rigor than a traditional model. You can get the scale of the traditional model, but you can also start to have the flexibility that you need to insert some of these ideas.
How does education happen?
It's a, I guess education and learning are two different things, which sometimes we confuse. One thing that I go at some depth in the book is education is several things. It's learning is part of it, the socialization is another part of it, and credentialing is the other part. And one, there are ways in which these things can get decoupled and then get optimized. But the learning part is, and it's really common sense. I think all of us have experienced this. Learning happens through interaction. Learning happens through activity. Learning happens through doing things. Learning happens through explaining to other people. It learns from from mentoring others and being mentored by others. And most of what I just described is actually absent in our classrooms.
So why would creating a One World, is that your concept, One World Schoolhouse, help that?
Yeah, and the title was purposely, it can be interpreted in multiple ways. We realized later one is slightly Orwellian, but it's not the intent. But one is obviously it kind of harkens back to one room schoolhouse, and there were definite negatives to the traditional one-room schoolhouse. It was something, if it's in a rural area, you might have not found, and you have the same issues now if you go to, still in a lot of rural areas, or if you go to a village in India, you might not find teachers to teach things, you might not find tools to teach it properly, but there are some advantages. When you have mixed age group classrooms, you have kids mentoring each other and being mentored by other students. You have students taking ownership of their knowledge. Oftentimes it is competency-based versus seat time-based. It doesn't feel like a factory. And so one thing that we talk a lot about is now that lecture can happen in other ways, you don't have to use this valuable class time for lecture. You can take that off the table, and when it's off the table, when it's happening at a student's own time, it's actually more valuable. They can pause, repeat, they can review something that they didn't understand. They would be embarrassed in a calculus class to say that they forgot their algebra. If they don't understand a term, they can look it up. But the real valuable thing is once you take that out of the classroom, now all of a sudden you don't have to go at one pace anymore. And you don't have to have this passive model. And when the students come together, it's not just about getting information, it's about interacting with each other and interacting with the teacher. A lot of times, when people read about something like Khan Academy or virtual education, they have this knee-jerk reaction. It's like, oh, this is like Amazon.com versus Barnes & Nobles. This is virtual attempting to replace physical. And then they say, well, the virtual can never replace physical because the human interaction is so important. And I agree with all of those statements. And the whole point here is that virtual will allow physical to actually become more human.
So you maximize the human interactions by flipping the classroom in a way.
Exactly. The flipping the classroom has become something of an overloaded word, but at a high level, yes. The one thing you always say is, oh, but lectures, human lectures are so valuable because I can ask questions in them. And I can sometimes, do stuff with my peers. I was like, yeah, I agree. Those are both very valuable things. And that's all. There should be no lecture involved.
Right. You should have the questioning and the collaboration happening.
That should be 100%.
Physically in the classroom.
That should be 100%.
In flesh.
Exactly.
And learning the
and the flipping the classroom is an idea that predates Khan Academy. Actually, a lot of the ideas in the book predate Khan Academy, sometimes by 100 years.
They all come from Ben Franklin.
They all come from Ben Franklin. But what's neat about this time in history is it looks like there's actually the traction and to actually do it at scale. And flipping the classroom, just for those of you who are interested, people came to me early on when I was just making the videos, and teachers, and saying, look, you've given a reasonable explanation of plate tectonics or of factoring polynomials. I'm not going to use class time to do that anymore. Kids can watch that at their own time. And what used to be homework, the problem solving that students used to have to do in a vacuum with no help, unless they had parents who knew how to do it or a sibling, they can now do that in the classroom and be interactive. We say go another level. As soon as you do that, it allows you to break free of this Prussian lockstep model. Every student should learn at their own pace. And it shouldn't be time-based, it should be competency-based.
And so you move along based on having mastered some particular component, right?
Yeah, and mastery is a big word, but that's the general idea. And I point out, at the university level, courses are actually measured in credit hours, which literally measure how much time you spent in a seat. And what we're saying is we need to move to a world, you're talking about decoupling credentials and learning. If you decouple credentials that measure competency, and they could be more rigorous than anything that goes on at any university, they could be things you have to retain to, you have knowledge decay so you can maintain that knowledge. If you do that, it liberates everyone to think about how they learn best. So they might want to go sit in a classroom, they might want to do something active, they might want to go tutor other people, they might want to learn from a book, from Khan Academy, from this edX that MIT and Harvard are doing. They might want to learn from an apprenticeship. It frees them to learn whatever makes sense for them.
What do you mean by Swiss cheese learning, or that problem?
Yeah, and once again, there's a chapter in the book about go into some depth, and it's when you look at the education system with really I think an open mind, it's somewhat obvious is what is happening. I mean, we see all of these situations. Many of us have experienced it. You get to algebra class, you get to calculus class, either yourself or you see your peers or your children or your relatives hitting a wall. They were smart students. They go there and all of a sudden they start flunking algebra. They start flunking calculus. And they're working as hard as they can. They seem smart in other things they do. They seem to have a really good teacher, but what's going on here? And the reality is that this model where you're in pre-algebra, you're covering exponents. And at the end of the week, we all have an exam on exponents. And you get an A, I get a B, you get a C. Some of y'all might fail the exam. The current model says, okay, you're smart, I'm a little less smart, you're a little less smart. The kids who failed are really not that smart. And even though we've identified you have this weakness in exponents, the whole class then moves to negative exponents, which assumes that you knew exponents.
Right.
And the analogy I draw is if you were building a house, a multi-story house, and you were to lay the foundation, you tell the contractor, look, we got to lay this foundation in exactly 1 week. I don't care if it rains. I don't care if the workers can't come, and they do the best they can. The inspector comes and says, well, there's a puddle there. The concrete's not dry. It's not quite up to code. This is an 80% foundation. And you say, great, that's passing.
Yes, right.
Let's build the first floor. Yeah. And actually, the reality in the schools is even if it failed, you would build the first floor because the curriculum just keeps moving. And then the first floor, the exact same thing. You tell the contractor, whatever, you have a week and a half to build this. You do the same thing, it's 70%. You keep building, keep building, keep building, and all of a sudden the fourth floor, while the contractor is working on it, the whole thing collapses. And you say, well, you must be an incompetent contractor. Or the workers aren't good. Or whatever it might be, when all along it was quite obvious.
But in your model, somebody doesn't get exponents while everybody else is moving on to negative exponents. How do you fix that?
Yeah, well, this is the way it works in a lot of other, this is the way it works in athletics, this is the way it works in music, this is the way it works in martial arts, is you just keep working on it. Yeah. When you have trouble with a certain technique in a sport, the coach doesn't say, oh, well, you're just horrible, let's move to the next technique. The coach says, keep working on that technique, because you're going to really need that if you want to do that more advanced one. And so that's what we advocate, and that's what we're seeing in classrooms. And there's a school in Oakland that I talk about in the book where there's an algebra class, and they were using Khan Academy as, it wasn't deeply integrated. They're using it more integrated now, but at least as a supplement. And when we looked at the data, it was clear this was an algebra class, but a lot of these kids didn't know how to multiply. They didn't know how to add fractions. They didn't know how to add negative numbers. We're like, no matter what the teacher does, and no matter how innately smart the kids are, they're just going to be talking past each other. And so this was the first time that the teacher actually saw these kids, and you might think, oh, this is going to slow these kids down. If in an algebra class you have kids working on negative numbers or working on their multiplication tables, it's going to slow them down. But what we're seeing is over and over again in every context, if you let those kids fill in those gaps, then the rest of the stuff starts looking intuitive to them. And so over and over again, we're seeing kids that are remediating multiplication, basic addition, whatever, and then they race ahead and become the best student in the class.
What is the role of tests and testing in getting this working?
Yeah, tests are an interesting thing. I also talk a lot in depth about in the book, is they are necessary to some degree. Otherwise, how do you measure? Not everything is measurable, but many things are. And I go at great pains to kind of talk about tests are self-fulfilling prophecies. There's a lot of superficial tests out there. A lot of times they add rigidity to the system, which is the last thing that we need. And the other thing that tests do is they're snapshots. They're snapshot assessments to say, what do you know right now? Yeah. And really, they're just samples of that because they're seldom comprehensive and they're high stakes and students get stressed and all the rest. But they're not really measuring potential, even though the administrator will say, yeah, I'm just measuring what you know right now, the grade that's gotten from the tests are used to value the human being, to say, oh, you're smart, you're less smart, you're going to be a doctor, you're not going to be a doctor. And so what we say is, no, tests should be a diagnostic. They shouldn't be just a snapshot. They should be over a long period of time narrative. There are things that you can measure that current tests don't, which is perseverance. You can start to get feedback from peers. How good are you at explaining things? How good are you at feeding into a system? And that when you see a weakness, it's not you're dumb or you're slow. It's you need to work on it.
Can you do tests and assessments that help you with a feedback loop? For example, you said a moment ago, and I'll pick just an example, a kid is struggling with quadratic formula, trying to solve quadratic equations. And the assessment of the mistakes that are being made by that kid is, you know what, the kid doesn't quite know how to multiply very well. And this kid knows how to multiply but doesn't know that x and y are different variables very well. Yeah. And so then you can loop them back to do the remedial Swiss cheese hole part.
Yeah, and so that's the meat of what Khan Academy is. I mean, people still associate it with these little videos that I make and others make. But the meat, we have a 20-person software engineering team. 5 of them are in analytics. And what they're working on, they literally call it the accuracy model. We have a primitive one right now where we want to launch a more advanced one in the next few months, which literally we generate these exercises for students. They cover nearly 500 skills right now. It's right now in math, but we want to go into other things. 500 skills. Each skill we can generate an infinite number of problems. And so we can give students problems, and as they answer and interact with the system, we can update the probability that they will answer that type of question right and all of the other types of skills, because there are correlations between them. And so at any given point, based on any interaction, we build a knowledge state of that user, and then we can figure out what is the next best activity. And this isn't an easy problem. This next stage is kind of, I think people will be perfecting it in 20 years. What is the next best activity to get them up their learning curve, which is what you're describing.
I mean, I've noticed that when by the way, you, besides buying the book, you really should tonight go to Khan Academy and leap in somewhere. It doesn't matter too much where you leap in, because if you leap in the wrong place, it'll help you go back a bit. But if you say, you know what, I never quite got calculus, there's that number one, first calculus thing, and it may send you back a bit to pre-calculus to learn a few things. You'll be surprised at how easy it is and how fun it is. Or if you want to do art history, do that. But play with it tonight. It'll be really good. What schools are actually now using Khan Academy and you're actually applying it?
Yeah, and it's and to the previous comment, the interactive stuff's primarily on math, K through trig. We have a little bit of calculus. The videos go much farther. But yeah, over time you're going to see it in all subjects.
Most people in this room don't need to go far beyond calculus tonight. Just if we could master
we'll try to stay ahead of you. We'll try to stay ahead of you. But there are videos. The videos go well into advanced stuff. The this is what's been, I think, even in hindsight for me, somewhat surprising. I mean, this whole whole adventure for me has been a series of these surreal events and/or Bill Gates. And not shortly after that, when we got our first funding from the Gates Foundation and Google, local school district Los Altos reached out, and they said, what would you do with the 5th grade classroom, math classroom? And it was just pie in the sky. I said, well, now that there's other ways to get lecture, I wouldn't base it on lecture. I don't think that's the most valuable use of a teacher. I would have every student learning at their own pace. I would give feedback, dashboards to the students, to the teachers as well. Teachers will see who's having trouble with what. And the teachers can either do focused interventions instead of slowing the whole class down. Someone gave me a report recently where they cited that at lecture, people often talk about teaching to the middle. It's actually been shown that during lecture, they teach to the 23rd percentile, which means that definitely 77% are not being catered to, but even the other 22 percentile are not being catered to. At any percentile, you're only catering to 1 percentile. Yeah. And so you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to slow down if one person has a question or speed up if people are getting bored. Everyone's working at their own pace. but that's hard to do without technology because it's this chaos. How do you, if there's 30 kids in the room, they're all doing something else, how do you coordinate it? Technology can coordinate and give teachers tools where they might want to intervene, who's helping whom with what, pair up students so they can work on stuff.
Right, I mean, another thing that you do a lot of when you apply it is this collaboration students with students, which actually educates you, not, you don't learn, but you're educated in how the real world works.
You're educated in how the real, I mean, this is one thing I talk a lot about. If I were to hire somebody, you know, right now when we measure students on their abilities, we look at academic ability. We look at their grades and their standardized test scores, and that's, oh, you're smart, you're less smart, et cetera. But there are at least 2 dimensions that matter at least as much, or probably more, which go completely unmeasured today. One is your creative works. What have you made? A portfolio of creative works. But we tend to associate that with what we think are creative professions, or art, music, architecture, but all professions are creative. Yeah. And if you're an engineering major, to come out without a portfolio is kind of crazy. If you're any major, if you're a humanities, to not have a bunch of writings that you can show, that's more valuable than your GPA. And then the third dimension is what you're referring to is, when I'm hiring someone, yeah, it's nice if they know calculus, it's nice if they know about French history, but I really care about someone who has the communication skills, the empathy, the interest in helping their peers. That's the person I'd want to work at my organization or at my school or my graduate school. And that goes unmeasured today. And I think it can be measured with peer-to-peer. Hey, you know, Walter helped me out with that, and it really got me across the curve. And I think we can start to do that.
We see that in the massive MOOCs, massive online, what's the other O?
I think there's one O is open. I don't know which one comes first, yes.
Courses, meaning if you take, we all are friends with Michael Sandel, you can vaguely take his justice course, but on edX, which is the MIT Harvard thing that you were the inspiration for because they were your professors, or Coursera or whatever, people, when they're doing it online and they're faced with an assessment online, virtually, I mean, in a virtual realm, love collaborating and helping each other. They form a community almost more than you would expect, so that there's a tale we were talking about of a kid in Pakistan with I guess the Taliban or somebody shut off the access to, and while the test was going on, and all the other people in this online course gathered to try to get the videos to her and the questions to her so they can all work together. And it's kind of weird because Harvard, which is pioneering this, and has a cheating scandal where everybody's helping, and they're sort of blurring the line between when are you supposed to collaborate this way. And Harvard, to its credit, is taking this seriously, which is, we are moving the boundaries between what used to be called cheating, and now we want people to collaborate. So this seems to be a new thing coming out of the type of thing you've invented.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I can't take all, I mean, there's a lot that's going on here. And what's exciting about this time, it's not just Harvard or MIT saying altruistically, which MIT famously did in 2001, saying, hey, we're going to put our course materials out there. That's great. They are doing that for altruistic reasons, but they're also saying, hey, we want this to challenge us on what our physical environment is about. And some of this collaboration, I do suspect, would occur in your traditional classroom at Harvard or MIT or anywhere if it wasn't passive, if it wasn't lecture-based, if the curriculum wasn't essentially set up as a big competition. I mean, you know, we call it learning, but the fact, anything that's going at a set pace is by definition an assessment. It's who can keep up with this pace. And when you're grading on the curve, it's by definition, it's a competition.
So you think edX may change, edX is sort of the Harvard MIT, may change the way we do higher education?
Oh, I think so, and I think it's going to happen far faster than most people expect. I was on a panel with John Hennessy, Stanford president, and you know, he surprised me. He just said, well, yeah, you know, we're seriously thinking about removing all lectures from campus in the next, I think he said 5 years. I mean, it was a dramatic statement. You know, this is hundreds of years. Lecture has been the predominant way of what a classroom's for. And so when you have your Harvards, your MITs, your Stanfords of the world seriously talking about how do we remove lecture, how do we make class time more interactive, that's every other institution in the world is going to look at them, K through 12, higher education, and say, well, yeah, that's what education is, and then they'll emulate.
Well, how does this tie in with the economics?
The economics are fascinating, and once again, I go into some depth on that. Well, there's a lot of dimensions to the economics. I mean, one thing I point out is if you ask students or parents why they're paying $200,000, you know, a significant, especially your present value, NPV of your total lifetime earning for a lot of people, going into debt that's not cancelable by bankruptcy, why you're doing it, they'll say, well, no, I mean, it's a good life experience and all of that, but at the end of the day, I have to have this if I want to have a career, if I want to have a white-collar job. And you can measure that. You go to Harvard graduation and say, look, pick a random student and say, I'll refund your tuition as long as you can never tell anyone you went to Harvard. You had all the experiences, you have all the friendships, you have all the great things. You just can never tell anyone.
We should try that test.
We should. I do not. And then actually figure out how much tuition you could refund. Actually, I think you would have to refund more than the tuition in order. I think it would have to be around $1 million for someone to not want that. And that tells you what they're paying for. They're paying for that credential. But then if you ask the universities, well, this costs a lot of money. Why is it? Look at our shampooed squirrels and look at. I'm kidding. Yeah. Look at. I think they do shampoo them, but they'll say, well, look at our research facilities. Look at the experience. Look at the community that we have on campus. And so this is a major transaction going on, where the buyer and the seller think that they're buying and selling two different things.
Correct.
And I think that there is opportunity to decouple that credentialing part. And there's several values there. One, I think then people will know why they're going to Harvard. They're going there for a holistic experience, and everyone can be honest. They're not trying to ace a philosophy exam so they get an interview at Goldman Sachs. They're learning philosophy for the sake of it. And it also would benefit the kid who goes down the street to Northeastern, who might learn the material just as well, maybe better than the Harvard grad. But when it comes time to interview, Goldman Sachs doesn't look at their resume because Northeastern, I don't know, I didn't go to Northeastern, I don't know how rigorous their courses are. Now if the credentials are decoupled, anyone, whether they went to college or not, can go take it, can be more rigorous than anything at any university. It could be oral, it could be whatever. Make it a $500
examination. In other words, a really good assessment that this person knows either philosophy, calculus, whatever, as well as any Harvard person.
Yeah. And then that's that. They know it, and it would be a fraction of what a college tuition is.
Well, this could, it disrupts a 400-year-old economic model of a research university in which teaching and undergraduate learning are coupled with research in research facilities and a place-based experience. And there is some danger, it would seem, to throw, because you would then lose the research university model.
Yeah, well, you would,
lose 80% of the research university.
I don't think there's risks of the Harvards of the world or the Stanfords of the world. I think, at the end of the day, if you go back 200 years, people who went to Harvard, and back then it was a small sliver of society, and it wasn't really merit-based. It was almost who are you versus what are you. It was you went there for a kind of a socialization experience or kind of a culture. For most of those students, they didn't either need a job or they were going to get a job whether or not they went to Harvard. And actually, at least in that environment, it was a very pure learning experience. Over time, that thing, because the elite did that, it started to become an aspirational thing. More and more people wanted to do it, and it then became the ticket to kind of entering the elite or becoming.
Right. You mean when James Bryan, Conan, and others create a meritocracy credentialing system out of research universities.
Exactly. So I suspect what's going to happen is people are going to still want to go to these universities. These initiatives like edX, this Harvard. I say these are going to make those universities even more popular. The analogy is the Vatican would not be as popular without the Bible. You want to go there, or Jerusalem wouldn't be as popular without the Bible. And so people will want to go there. They'll want to meet those professors in the flesh and all the rest. They want to be part of that community. I think it will be difficult and I think the schools that are not well known but are inexpensive but they are providing good value, I think it's going to be very good for them.
It's sort of that middle level, I hate to say it, but the Vanderbilt, Emory, or what,
I think they're going to have to really justify charging $50,000 a year. If I could go to a community college and then go take a credential that gets
Harvard or MIT
that has that same exact that I can go get a job at Goldman Sachs or Facebook or anywhere. It doesn't have to be just those companies. And so they will have to kind of think about especially the undergrad tuition model. I think the graduate programs, the research, that's all great. And that's when we say we have great university systems, that's what we're talking about. We're really talking about we have the best research universities in the world. We have the best graduate programs in the world.
Right.
The undergrad, it's still this Prussian model.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to focus on the community college because that's where the students take
Focus on the community college because that's where a fusion could take place.
No, that's exactly right. I think, and at that point, that should become more for the community because you could jump in. It won't necessarily have to be you have to get an associate degree for 2 years. You're like, hey, look, there's this assessment. I'm being told that this micro assessment in, it could be something high, it could be computer programming, it could be a very esoteric thing, or it could be something like as basic as bookkeeping. But I could say, hey, look, this thing is in demand. I mean, I even see stats on the people who get to this threshold on the assessment, they're doing well in the marketplace. I'm going to prepare for that. And there might be online resources to do it, but there might be a local community college course to say, yeah, we have a 6-week thing. This is our pass rates. Gives you good information. It costs $1,000 for you to come. You're like, hey, that's good value for me, and I'm going to go do it. And then all of a sudden, I have a very a powerful thing. And when people talk about structural unemployment, I think this is what it's about. It's not necessarily even that people don't have skills. It's that the signaling, which are these credentials, are broken right now. Is that it's very hard for a 50-year-old laid-off factory worker who might have been fiddling with computers his whole life as a hobby and is maybe just as good as a recently minted Stanford grad. And he's made all these programs and whatever else. It's almost impossible right now for him to prove to Google that his mind is just as agile, he's just as hardworking, he knows more possibly. And the only thing, it's not like he can go back to. He could go back to a community college maybe, and that's a huge investment of time and money. But there's nothing else that he could do. But now anyone can prove that they know something.
Yeah, sorry.
Could you say a word about the results of what you've had from the schools where it's been used?
Yeah, so I went on a tangent when Walter asked the first time about the schools. Los Altos, when we made the recommendation, they decided to start this pilot. They did it with 2 5th grade classes and 2 7th grade classes. What was surprising, the 5th grade classes did just fine. Los Altos is a fairly affluent neighborhood in Silicon Valley, and they did just fine, 96% at grade level or above, which wasn't surprising. The district average was 92%, and they had great teachers, so at least it didn't do harm, which often isn't asked. The fascinating thing was what happened in the 7th grade classrooms, because these were actually remedial math classes. Many of the students were diagnosed with learning disabilities. Many of them were kind of from the other side of El Camino, the poorer side of El Camino. Many of them English as a second language. Parents didn't speak English or go to college. And it was fascinating because they obviously all started well below grade level. And what was amazing is I always had this fear that when you do the self-paced reality that you would see a spread and the slow would go further behind and on all the rest. But what we saw is you let these kids work on their foundational material. The whole distribution moved in the right direction. And what shocked us and what shocked the district is there was a handful of kids in a remedial math class who were now testing at an advanced level. And they had never seen that in any, remedial math class is normally your academic graveyard. You're just going to fall further and further and further behind. And so they saw that. Then they went district-wide. So this past year they went district-wide with 5th and 6th grade. The results have been good. We haven't released those yet, but they're now going district-wide with 5th through 8th grade. On top of that, we've been working with Summit Prep. They're famous for Waiting for Superman. We've been working with their San Jose campus, and now they're expanding to their other campuses. KIP has been doing, they have a lot of their own internal assessment. I talk a little bit about this, I go into all of these in the book in depth, but on KIP, they tried it out. The big shock to me is I thought all of this was going to be, is this for the self-paced learner, maybe for my cousins, but we're seeing the most dramatic gains in the kids that were furthest behind. And the reason it's becoming clear to me, at least, why they were so far behind is that they had these core big gaps in basic addition, multiplication. We see it in the data. I mean, there's 13-year-olds that don't know their multiplication tables. And you just fill in that gap, and all of a sudden they're able to engage at the same level as anybody.
That's so cool. It actually chokes me up because
I've
seen that happen.
I don't want you to cry.
Yes, yeah.
Hi. My question sort of follows on what you're saying, but I'm a former school administrator in curriculum, and we still have a school calendar. And in most public schools, in elementary and middle school, it's heterogeneous, classrooms. So let's say 3/4 of the class is getting this higher skill, and you are working from September to June, and you do have these kids you're filling in, and all this type of thing, but they can't finish whatever that curriculum is, say for 5th grade.
Yeah.
So what do? Did the children are not promoted, or what? I mean, there's always those kids that are going to take a long time to get it, and we certainly hope that they do eventually get it, but the rest of the class has to go on to 6th grade.
Yes. So, there's two kind of dimensions to that. One is, it is definitely in existing schools, public, private, charter, there's these structural rigidities in there that make it very hard to go fully in this model. And we're working with a ton of schools, 50 directly, and 20,000 are using it in some way, shape, or form, to see how they can start moving into this direction. And that what you're describing is a core issue. Even in this school in Oakland, it was an algebra class. So to some degree, even while these kids were remediating basic multiplication, we thought it was kind of silly, but the teacher had to cover systems of equations. They had to cover this. And they usually have to water down the curriculum, make it very pattern matchy so that the kids can pretend that they're able to do the algebra. But at a holistic level, I think I actually personally believe that it's far better for you to, right now, that's the problem. Social promotion is tied to academic competency right now, which forces people to, well, do we want the kid who's going through puberty to be with the kids who are, not, and all of that. And that's why we have to break it. That's why I think you have multi-age classrooms. Then no one knows who's being promoted with whom. You could be really strong in one subject. You could be remediating in another. And the thing I point out is, and I haven't had anyone really argue this the other way, is it's far more important to have at least a solid, you don't have to be the master of the universe in algebra, but a solid understanding of algebra than to have a superficial understanding of algebra followed by even more superficial understanding of pre-calculus and barely. I mean, so many people who've taken calculus, I ask them, just no problems, just what is it about? What was able to happen in the world from this calculus thing that people couldn't do before? Usually you don't get an answer, and it shows how much pattern matchy and superficial a lot of the learning has been.
Go ahead, you're right there, yeah.
Thank you. So cool to hear the background, and funny and cool about the free software, because all this is available to anyone everywhere in a sense, to a lot of people. Looking at the YouTube channel looks awesome. I'm wondering, are you thinking about additional content focused on higher ed, colleges, and in the softer subjects? Because there's a lot of math, finance, chemistry, the hard stuff.
Yes. Well, at MIT where I went, actually, economics was considered a humanities. So
That's right.
If you would, I'm serious. You actually get a humanities course.
It is a soft subject at MIT.
Soft, yes. Yeah. No. But the simple answer is yes. You saw a little bit of art history. Those folks actually started independently of me. They started around the same time, and they have some of the similar sensibilities. It's very conversational. It makes you feel like you could participate in the conversation. We want to actually build tools so that you could record your own subjective views on the art. We do have a little bit of history right now. It kind of focuses on kind of the scaffold of history. I have talked to some interesting people about. I think they could add some value in a lot of these domains. So the simple answer is yes, and I think we could even go to metal. I mean, I've somewhat joked about this, but I've even thought about doing dating advice or advice in general, because even for my own is advice is you never want it when someone's just kind of feeding it to you. You're like, no, I'm whatever. I don't need I don't need you. But then in your the quiet times in the middle of the night, and you're kind of wondering whether you should date that person or not. You're like, well, let me see what that person has to say, and just kind of get it on demand. But yeah, I think there's something there.
That is definitely something. I'm sorry, let me go back. But you've been waiting a while, and then we'll do this row, and then get back to you. Yeah.
I'm really interested in some aspects that you touched on, but didn't go deeply into. But that's about character building and socialization, and because we always look at the computer as a kind of an enemy to those things, and what you're saying suggests that it's not an enemy at all, but can be used to an advantage. So, particularly among, say, disadvantaged populations, how is that working?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of dimensions to that. One dimension is what we saw in Oakland, and their test scores improved and all of that. But the teacher, if you look up Oakland Unity Khan Academy, he's written a blog about it. Is the single biggest thing he saw change in these students was they started taking ownership of their own learning. They were used to just being passive, and this is students everywhere. Hey, if I'm not learning, it's your fault. And tell me what to do next. Tell me what to do. If I don't know the answer to the problem in 2 seconds, well, I don't know. I'm not good at math. And you just give up. And now that they were actively picking what they wanted, seeking out help, doing interventions with each other. They had to tutor each other so that there's motivation to know the material. They were taking ownership. The second dimension is what we were talking about in terms of just this peer-to-peer socialization. And you know, I go at some length of that in the book it's kind of common sense. Human beings, I mean, at 13 or 14, we are biologically adults. You know, evolution, you can have children at, I'm not advocating it, but you are biologically capable of having children at, you know, from 12, 13, 14 years old. And that would not be capable if at least you're somewhat wired to handle responsibility. And our current system, your only responsibility is for yourself. My test scores, my exam tomorrow. And one of the advantages of having a mixed age group and doing peer-to-peer tutoring is now all of a sudden you can actually exercise leadership with people. When you're 16, you will have responsibility for 13-year-olds, for 9-year-olds, and take them up their learning curve. And I think that's where a lot of teenage angst comes from. And you see, you know, people become as mature as they're expected to be. You know, you see kids at, you know, a lot of college campuses, they might be partying hard and whatever else, but then the same exact age kids, some of these kids were cut-ups in high school, you send them to the military, and all of a sudden it's life and death, they're responsible for their peers. They mature, they're 10 years more mature than their peers sitting at you know, in the frat house.
That's the most important of all socialization processes. Way in the back there, I've discriminated, I think it was in front of Elizabeth, wasn't there a woman there holding up your hand? Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, your mission is free education for anyone, anywhere. And I'm just very curious, have you thought about reaching poor children in the developing world in different languages? What's your thoughts on that?
Yes. So part of the initial Google funding was to translate a lot of the content. We now have 7,000 videos. So we have 3,400 videos in English. We have 7,000 videos in other languages. And I won't even say they're translations. A lot of them have been redone in other languages. Actually, on my slide deck, I have a montage of what they look like. I mean, they're actually, it's quite fascinating to see algebra in Farsi or Hebrew or whatever else. And we've already seen amazing things. Obviously, access is a big issue in a lot of the world. I talk a lot in the book about, I think that is, one, it's already being solved. Even at today's price points, it's actually the cost is not the deciding factor. If you think about a computer, it could be used by 4 or 5 kids. It can be used for 4 or 5 years. The cost per day actually starts to get into the pennies. So it's not actually a cost issue. It's a structural issue. But even that's going to solve itself. Everything's getting cheaper. Broadband's becoming more and more available. To some degree, they might be able to leapfrog what's happening in the developed world. But yeah, I think the implications in the developing are even more powerful. Because even if you have resources, it's hard to find teachers oftentimes. Even if you can, teacher absenteeism, you know, in India, the whole subcontinent, it's 50% teacher absenteeism oftentimes. Even then, it's hard to track what's actually happening. I mean, you know, the one thing that's kind of boggled my mind, even before Khan Academy, is people have been building schools, village schools. People have been putting computer labs in villages forever. And no one has even written a little piece of software to say, is this computer being used? A little thing that pings or maybe it just goes in a little disk drive and someone runs it to the village computer and just, is this thing being used? And just even that dimension is incredible. But then if you go to the level of how is it being used, how is the 14-year-old girl in Calcutta comparing to the 16-year-old boys in Nairobi, you can start to get a sense of things. And you can start to identify, you know, I talk about this, the percentage of people right now that we're recognizing as really talented and who could push humanity forward, I think is maybe 10% of the people that we could be having. And so there's a girl right now who in Calcutta who could be the person who comes up with the cure for cancer, and instead she's going to end up becoming a prostitute or who knows what. And I think there's an opportunity not only to enable these students, but also to identify them and to at least, you know, tell them, look, there's someone there that's a little bit off the charts. And we're already starting to see that with a lot of our schools. We're telling the school, I don't know if you've realized, but this kid is off the charts. And like, yeah, well, we didn't really realize it. He was a little bit, didn't fit in and this and that, but he's off the charts. And I think you know, we actually saw that there's a group who has set up computers in Mongolia, and they set up Khan Academy at an orphanage, a girls' orphanage. And there's this one girl, Zaya, she's now 17. She started when she was 15. She started working on Khan Academy and got excited. And now she is our prime instructor in Mongolian. She has made 100 videos in the Mongolian language on algebra and trigonometry and all the rest. And I mean, that's the type of stuff. Yeah, holy shit! Yeah, no, exactly. It's like out of a science fiction
Just in case
book.
You didn't catch that with the holy shit.
Yeah,
yeah, right there. I'm sorry. I've never seen so many questions. Usually, right, there's a gentleman here, and I'll go back over there in a minute.
So we all saw, I guess, a few weeks ago, the whole debate about the unions in Chicago, and curious what the reaction has been. I mean, I bet if you did a poll in this room, we'd vast majority of us would agree with you and think that this is a great idea. Curious how much pushback you've gotten from the teachers' unions.
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and you know, the thing that makes me very optimistic about everything that's happened so far, and I don't want to jinx me or the organization, it's not just me, we're 36 people now, is you know, Los Altos was a public school district, unionized, all the rest. It never even came up. It never, and you know, I think it was just because of the amazing teachers, amazing faculty, and when they wanted to do it, they made it happen. On a national level, I know they're aware of us, the unions, but I don't think they have at least a strong, they haven't made a public opinion about us. And it is because a lot of the teachers are just doing it on their own. The teachers want to do it. And you know, we are very clear, this isn't about replacing teachers, this isn't about increasing student-teacher ratios, this is about making classrooms more human, this is about empowering teachers. So far, you know, we haven't kind of bumped up against that.
Yeah, I promise. Yeah, the woman there, yes, who very active in that.
Thank you. My name is Meredith. I work at education sector, and I wanted to thank you for coming. And I have a question. We talk a lot about the Common Core at Ed Sector recently. How can this model of instruction contribute to the success of the Common Core? You know, in our world, we're very concerned about the rollout, how that's going to work. What can you offer us with that?
Yeah, the Common Core is an interesting thing. I mean, I think it's a very good idea. I think it's a, you know, we've mapped a lot of our stuff to the Common Core. I think the reality of today, the Common Core, it hasn't really changed what's happening in classrooms. And to some degree, I think the standard setting process, if you really kind of take it's a little bit of just an exercise, because math is math. You could do a superset. If someone knows their math, if they have true competency in algebra, they should be able to walk into a classroom in Finland, a classroom in Singapore, a classroom in Mars, and so I know my algebra. And they should be able to engage. And the standards actually in that reality don't matter that much. And when you do create standards, and the Common Core actually, it's not a curriculum, it's not even example problems, it's kind of ideas that should occur in a student's mind. And I was talking to Walter about this earlier, is if you really want to define a curriculum, they should have started with the assessments. And you know, there's all this, it's a very non-PC thing about, you know, assessments and all of that. And I agree, a lot of the assessments are bad. So if people are teaching to a bad assessment, that is bad instruction. But if you can have better assessments, and if you have better assessments, and at the end of the day, that's the problem with the Common Core now. They release the Common Core, they're like, oh, where's the assessment to measure? And they're like, oh, we're going to spend a few $100 million and write a test, I guess, to create it. And so I think it's all going to hinge on what that is. I don't know. I've spent hours looking at the Common Core. We've mapped our stuff. We have 98% coverage of the Common Core and then some and all the rest. But when you read those standards, you're like, well, what do they really mean by that thing? And you won't really know until they come up with an assessment. And then you say, oh, now I know what they mean. And then it'll actually be easier to debate whether this is a valuable thing or not.
Yes, right there. Mm-hmm. And both of you can.
Hi. My question is bringing it a little bit closer to home. My husband and I have started using Khan Academy for our 8-year-old, and we've stumbled across it. And between the two of us, we have 2 Harvard degrees that we're still paying for. And my professional life is I run a nonprofit a few blocks from here for kids who come from low-income families and have limited resources. And we serve 100 kids for 600 hours outside the classroom. So we've struggled a lot with, we can't recreate the school day, but what do I do with them when they come every day after school in summer to tackle the achievement gap? And we're looking at bringing technology into the classroom to use programs like Khan Academy to do the self-paced learning, to catch the gaps. I think what would really be useful for us would be a combination of the academic skills as well as the character building and sort of instilling the grit in our kids that they can keep going. But that's something that if you don't get at home, how do you start building that in the kids that we are going to be seeing 600 hours a year?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean,
just hand it to the person next to you.
And that's our goal. I mean, one thing I do want to stress is I mean, already we're seeing exciting things. We're seeing exciting traction. You know, this exciting stories, exciting data too. But we think we're like, you know, tip of the iceberg right now. I mean, the very, very early stages. And you know, when we imagine what we think we can be in 5 years or 10 years, it's well beyond what it is today. And some of the things we hope to address, we do already have badges on perseverance and badges on this or that. And you know, like, and we are thinking about, you know, people like LeBron James literally reached out to us. And we're like, well, we could have you ask questions about humidity. And which is actually fascinating. But we are thinking about using personalities like him to instill, because one thing I've actually learned in my brief interactions with him is how incredibly hardworking he is. I mean, he could eat any of our lunch in terms of how, during the basketball season, how focused these guys are. And so if we could create little videos about perseverance, little videos about this, that aren't necessarily even part of a lesson. It's like while you're struggling on the site, you're having trouble getting proficiency, that video pops up. And for some kids it might be LeBron James, for someone else it might be Taylor Swift, for someone else it might, who knows, might be the right person. Maybe we can eventually have analytics to see which videos help people re-engage. So that's something we take seriously. I don't think we're anywhere close to solving the problem, so to speak, though.
My question is to follow up a little bit on the, I'm over here.
Oh yes.
Previous person, I work a lot in India in the higher education sector. Only 12% of secondary school leavers go on to tertiary education because there's really no spaces. So Minister Sybil has famously said, we're going to build 1,000 new colleges, by 2020, and tens of thousands of new universities, 1 million new teachers. At last year's U.S.-India Higher Education Summit, Sam Petroda, Mr. Innovation, famously said, we're going to do distance education and we're not going to need teachers anymore. But your model really, the teacher is even more important. It's much easier to lecture for many teachers than it is to, as you were saying, Walter, identify those kids, that girl in Mongolia, identify and enable. And it really makes the teacher's role very, very different. So in a country like India, where there are these huge, supply-demand issues, how do you see the Khan Academy fitting in?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I mean, to the teacher point, it's not just you're not lecturing anymore, but literally some of these classrooms in Los Altos, it's a 5th grade classroom. There's a few kids who are doing trigonometry. There's a few kids who are doing early calculus in a 5th grade classroom. And a traditional 5th grade teacher would not have to worry about that. And so it takes, the teacher has to get to another level in 5th grade if they can kind of work with that. It usually means stepping back and not being the source of all knowledge, but saying, hey, let me work with you. I need to review that stuff myself as well. I do think the model will be different in resource-rich places, and I would say all of America is resource-rich, even the inner city relative to places like India, where you do have classrooms, you do have teachers who kind of know what they're doing, and they're professional. In places like India, if you have that, that's exactly what we would advocate, that you have that model. In places where you don't, and only where you don't, I think it would be interesting to explore really kind of these peer-to-peer hierarchies where you could have, kids who are, I saw a news piece last year about a kid outside of Bengal. We were actually very proud because it was actually my ancestral village. And he was like a 16-year-old who just self-organized a school. And he started teaching the younger kids, and the younger kids were, were teaching even younger kids. And so I think self-organizing things like that can add value. It won't be as good as maybe what might happen in Los Altos or even in what's happening in Oakland, but it will move the dial. And what anytime I meet a minister of education or someone in a policymaker, I say, look, I mean, it's great to have these. We're going to put X billion into this program or X billion into community colleges. But what you need to do, if you want to, spend $100 million and create this credentialing architecture. You create this credentialing architecture, make it universally respected, work with the ecosystem. The people are going to figure out ways to prepare for it. People are going to, and there's going to be the not-profit sector is going to compete, the for-profit sector is going to compete. They're all going to compete. But that's going to be much more valuable to people.
And the way back there, since I've been discriminated against, the way back, yes. Yeah. And then, we'll end in about 5 minutes, but he'll stick around to do the other questions and sign books.
My daughter discovered the Khan Academy a long time ago before I ever heard of it, and not surprisingly. And when she told me she had been using it because I saw it on her computer screen, my first response was, no offense intended, are you sure this guy knows what he's talking about?
That's a good question.
And it really is my question, though, with the advent of the Khan Academy, which is wonderful, by the way, and MOOCs and all the different things that are happening with students searching for help out there, how do you exert quality control and be sure that they're getting it right?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question, and actually, I think it's an exciting time for this too. Well, I think I think brand still matters. we even inadvertently built a brand, you know, in 2006, 2007, when those first videos were out there. Yeah, it's a very legitimate. Who is this character who's, you know, doing sometimes seemingly a little eccentric? Who is this guy? And, you know, I had a few credentials and maybe say, oh, well, this guy might know what he's doing. But it's really the word of mouth. Hey, no, I actually learned from this guy, and it did well in school, and I tell your friends, and that's how it grows. And that's where I think we had to build a brand from scratch. The MOOCs, Harvards, and MITs of the world obviously come with a very strong brand. And actually for them, the risk is, you know, people outside of those walls assume that what goes on there is just amazing. It's just, you know, knowledge just pours into you. And you know, when you expose it, you're like, well, this is you know, it's hit and miss.
This professor doesn't have it right.
Yeah, so, you know, some of it's really good, but some of it, you know, I've seen better. And so that's actually a question for them, is that a lot of their brand was on the, I wonder what's going on behind the walls of Harvard University. But what's really exciting, you know, people ask, you know, I've made a few history videos, or, you know, well, who's your editor? You know, you just take these things and stick them up there. Like, who's going to say you're, and it's true, you know, if I was a publisher, I would have 3 or 4, you know, folks with PhDs, you know, looking at stuff. I don't know about this or that. But what I point out, we put the stuff out there. Within a week, 20,000 people watched it.
You have about 100,000 editors.
Yes, not all of them are friends either.
Yeah.
They are very quick to point out anything that is even, you know, I mean, it is a much scarier. I mean, I can't tell you how many professors I've talked to who have wanted to do this, and they're like, wait, but any of my peers can see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I won't say, I talked to a medical professor, and we're trying to do medical videos, and he's like, well, what if I say something wrong? I was like, what have you been doing the last 20 years? What have you been telling your, like, I don't know, that's the issue. In a traditional classroom, there's people who know less than you in the room. They're not going to call you on your thing.
Have you ever revised one?
All the time, all the time. And that's, you know, that's the other thing. We revise much quicker. We don't have to wait for the next textbook publication cycle. We can have analytics. We know we made the error. I mean, in a traditional, professor might be doing it for 30 years, and there's not one freshman who's willing to stand up and say, no, you didn't. And the other thing I point out is on the objectivity. History is subjective. Is, you know, I did a thing on the CIA intervention in Chile, and I used all the primary documents released, CIA.gov, you know, literally screenshots of it, and I got American students saying, oh, well, you know, you don't realize it was the Cold War and you're being, you know, more harsh. But then I got Chileans showing up and saying, you've completely whitewashed history, you're an imperialist, you are a mouthpiece for the American government, and so, you know, someone said my uncle died in that intervention, and at first I was like, this didn't happen in my algebra videos, and this didn't happen in a traditional history class. But then you're like, well, this should happen in a traditional history class. You're giving a lecture, and there's some Chilean kid should walk through the room and says, you're wrong. You're wrong. That's exactly the wrong side of history. That's what makes it a valuable discourse.
Right there. Sorry, you've been waiting for a while. Yes.
Oh, me? Okay. My concern and my challenge to you is, how are we going to make sure that this incredible resource is available to students who cannot see what you have on the board? Because in our country, we make things accessible by policy. And what's your policy in terms of accessibility and making it available for all?
No, it's an awesome question. And I mean, in all frankness, when I started this, I didn't even know about this whole space of how do you make something. You know, the first time said, are you making it accessible? I was like, yeah, it's there. And I didn't realize what they were talking about. And now we know a little bit more about it. One thing that, I mean, there's different layers to it. People have actually told me that for visually impaired students, it's almost, you know, we didn't design it for visually impaired students, but they say it's almost there. We do have to do things that will make it more accessible. A lot of times in the video I say, yeah, right here, if I said in the top right, or if I say this picture of this. We haven't done enough in that direction. There have been, it is closed caption, so for hearing impaired, it does seem to work well. Definitely for students with learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia. We've heard good stories. We haven't done any studies yet, but just the fact that it's on demand, you can pause it. You know, there's a lot of studies that now that written text is much easier to process than text that just pops up or PowerPoint, especially for students with dyslexia. But we don't have any data on that, just anecdotal right now. But we want to address it.
Yeah. Last 2 questions right there, and maybe I'll see if I can combine or. Yeah.
So thanks. I'm trying to reconcile 2 things that you talked about. Early on, you talked about the crisis in that the most important thing is supporting creativity. And you also talked about assessment as being, you know, the key way to, you know, distinguish. To me, these things are in conflict, because if you're really trying to talk about creativity, learning, I don't know how you're going to come up with a single one-time assessment after your 20 weeks of learning that are going to show this. And if you kind of go to video learning, which is really more fact-based, and you're relying on the teachers to do the creativity, but you're not evaluating that because it's all after. So I'm just trying to see if you can
so
help
I
me
don't think
understand
I actually don't think they're contradictory. I think they're perpendicular. They're orthogonal. That one, and I think this has been the key issue in the math wars and all these cultural divides on education is the culture of creativity versus the culture of, oh well, how do we know that they definitely know how to take a derivative or whatever else. And I go at length in the book, and we're actually building this now. Is yes, Khan Academy started with this kind of traditional kind of stuff that goes on in classrooms. But what I think, and I'll talk in a second about how we're doing it on the site, is what's going to be valuable is that's going to be valuable, these competencies and kind of skills. Your portfolio of creative works. Your portfolio of creative works is one, someone can just look at it. But I think there's actually a lot of power in crowd assessment. How do you assess subjective things? And the crowd can say, hey, well, that's pretty good. That, on these metrics, I can critically analyze, how good was that composition, or at least in my opinion, and you could get an aggregate opinion. How hard was that to do? How technically difficult that computer program, that piece of art? Who knows what it might be? And so you could actually start to get some way of assessing subjective things, creative things. And one thing that we've recently launched that we're very excited about is our Khan Academy Computer Science is not based on videos. It's not based on traditional exercises. Hey, is this a bubble sort or a quick sort or anything like that? It's an environment where kids can create, and then they share it with their friends, and then their friends can rate it, fork it off. If you set up your portfolio on Khan Academy, I have my own portfolio. I've actually grown. This is actually the first time in a lot of the stuff I kind of know. So I use it for review sometimes, but this was the first time on the site that I got very actively involved. Started making these little computer programming things, and they're very visual, and we wanted to explain, kind of have the creative side of computer programming. So you're making screensavers within 10 minutes. So those are and the third dimension is also how good are you explaining things. But yeah, in my mind, I think all three of those dimensions are super, super important.
But just so I don't think you leave an impression you don't leave in your book, you actually do believe assessments and even testing are an important component of knowing, do you have this basic mastery of this particular skill that you need to go on to the next one.
I think
and we shouldn't blow that away.
Yes, they're one, I would say, of the three important dimensions. One is, yes, do you have this competency? Do you have a scaffold of knowledge in this? But what I point out in the book is, being able to do algebra or being able to do calculus for a mathematician, that's like, can the artist mix paint? Or that's like, is the athlete flexible? It doesn't really express, are they a good mathematician or are they a good athlete? So that's one dimension, but it is nice to know whether they have those skills. But then the other dimensions, which could be at least as important or more important, are the portfolio, maybe with some crowd assessment, and feedback on how good they were at explaining and teaching others.
Yeah, last question. I'm sorry, there's so many more questions, but you can buy the book and get the answer. In life, there sometimes are answer keys.
Just curious, you're located in Silicon Valley and you're a not-for-profit, and there are a zillion for-profit entities trying to emulate what you do at various levels, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, so a good question. It allows me to get a little self-righteous. The not-for-profit, for-profit question, we're a bizarre organization in that, when I was starting off 2007, 2008, middle of Silicon Valley, a lot of my friends are venture capitalists. They would come up and say, we could fund this thing, we could have a double bottom line. But I'm like, which one's on the bottom? And they're like, no, it's a double bottom line. They're both there. They share the bottom space. We could figure out a way to make money, and we can fund you, and it's very intriguing. And I'm not someone against becoming rich. I could buy some new clothes and whatever else. But but meeting two or three became a little bit not wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with for-profits. A lot of the innovation, a lot of the great stuff in the world is happening because of for-profits. But I realized I was getting so much from just the random students, the random parents coming up to me and saying, "Oh, thank you so much," and we just bumped into it, and it helped our kids so much. And any wall against using it would have just been a bummer. And there's also, and this was mildly delusional at the time, it felt like we're at an inflection point in history. If you look at, the printing press. You look at the European colonization of North America, the Industrial Revolution. At every one of those points, you literally had new institutions. Colonization, you have your Ivy Leagues. Your Industrial Revolution, you have your engineering schools, you have your land-grant colleges. We are at least as big as an inflection point. And it was, I read a lot of science fiction, so I was like, oh, what if Khan Academy could be one of these institutions for this new inflection point? It takes advantage of it. And I didn't know a lot about the not-for-profit sector at the time, but I was like, well, what are institutions, things that have to last, have a long view, that be around past one person, past any spoiled kids inheriting it, or who knows what might happen, or acquisitions. And it was really the not-for-profit structure. And so the corollary to your question is, okay, well, that's good, but how are you going to support yourself? Especially, not-for-profit in theory can charge money. Universities do it very well. How do you support yourself, especially because we've put in our mission statement that the learning side will be free. And there, I think, that we didn't really know coming out of the gate. We still are philanthropically supported, and if anyone is feeling generous, please talk to us. But we think that there are ways to support ourselves that don't contradict with the mission. Sesame Street has done very well licensing Elmo dolls. I don't know if I would have the same appeal. The doll could be called Unibrow.
Yes, right.
Yeah, but we are starting to license our content to for-profits who want to use us as part of something else, and that seems like it could be interesting. The credential side is, if there's a $200 credential where you can prove that you know computer science as well as a Stanford grad that just paid $200,000, and it costs $100 to administer that credential, and then the other $100 is reinvested to create materials to prepare people for it. I think that would be consistent with our mission. It would be providing a social service and allow us to support ourselves. So yeah, we're looking at all above. Some people want to use our platform for proprietary, for corporate training, for things like that, and we would be happy to license it to them. Yeah, we're exploring that. But yeah, we're dedicated to nonprofit. We're dedicated to being free, and we really do hope to be an institution. And actually, not to go, the biggest fear we had actually last year was whether we would be able to get the talent in Silicon Valley, being a not-for-profit, but being really a software company that's not-for-profit. We don't give options. We're competing with Facebook. We're competing with Google, all these startups. And what's been very refreshing for us is not only are we getting talent, and we pay well. We are paying upper quartile Silicon Valley. Our board is committed. This is high leverage content. We don't give options, but we're getting the very best talent out there. Craig Silverstein, Google's first employee, wrote the first search engine, is on our team. John Ressig, the world's most famous JavaScript programmer, literally is on our team. We have our head of engineering, head of design. We're the head of engineering, head of design at one of the most reputable firms in the planet. They were involved in building Stack Overflow. So we're getting some really, really incredible people. So it's made me very optimistic about the future. The for-profit, and I know all of them. I know the founders, and I think they've all started with the right intentions. And I think at the beginning, they just had a philosophical belief. There is a knee-jerk belief in Silicon Valley that, not-for-profit's inefficient. Not-for-profit's not going to be able to attract talent. I think we've proven both of those things wrong. I think actually we have the best team in Silicon Valley across all, our 36 people against any 36 people in Silicon Valley head-to-head is as good as anybody or better. And it's as efficient, and we're getting more leverage than most for-profits. But I think there is that knee-jerk, oh, no, you don't have the discipline of all of that. I think they're going to face tough decisions. Right now, they can behave very similar to us in that, we're giving it away for free, we're trying to help people, we're trying to educate. I think there's, I used to be an analyst at a hedge fund. I know how shareholders work. I know how capital structure works. I know how fiduciary responsibility to shareholders work. It is against the law to do something in a for-profit that does not maximize shareholder value. And at some point, that will come into conflict with your mission.
I want to say that it's very rare that we actually are at an inflection point in history. As you said, it happened with the land grant and other types of universities and engineering schools that came in the Industrial Revolution, or the original Ivy Leagues that came with colonialism. We are definitely at an inflection point, and it's a great honor, really, to be in a room with somebody who has created the first amazing institution of this inflection point. The book is One World Schoolhouse, Education Reimagined. Coolest guy in America. Oh, thank you, Sal. Book is for sale out there. great.